The year is 1931, and our story takes place in Tainan. Murakami Naojiro had edited and published a collection of documents he titled the Sinkan Manuscripts, the Sinkan Manuscripts. These 109 contracts from the Qing dynasty were known locally by Taiwanese Minnan as Huanake. These were made for the native Pingpu plainsmen. 87 were from Sinkan, and 20 of those were bilingual with both Han characters and Sikandar writing. As the Taiwanese frontier gave way to modern Japanese society, Naojiro was contemplating a significant manifestation of the previous colonizations. When the Dutch East India Company colonized Taiwan, or Formosa then, they found a long lagoon where Fujianese and Japanese pirates gathered, and a coastal plain populated by Austronesian islanders, the Aboriginal Taiwanese. Here, on the plains, each native settlement was its own fortified polity, and they already had their own established patterns of war, trade, and diplomacy. Some even held alliances and diplomatic missions with factions in Fujian and Japan. They viewed their territories as concentric spheres, with a village in the middle, surrounded by their orchards and gardens, on the borders of which were their hunting grounds, and further away, the lands of other peoples. These they warred or allied with to maintain a balance of power. In this environment of arrows and spears and headhunting, the musket-savvy Dutchmen no doubt seemed like a powerful force, and the Sinkanders were quick to ally. The Dutch would learn the diplomatic language of the southwestern plain, and through negotiation and firepower, managed to secure the loyalty of many tribes. As the Dutch established their hegemony, they felt it important to proselytize amongst the natives. Their strategy was not to force their Dutch and Nederlander culture on the locals, but instead to have missionaries learn, make scripts for, and translate the Bible into the local languages. The missionaries got to work and also set up schools, teaching the Christian religion as well as Western literature. The Sinkanders, Taiwan, Favorlang, and others would learn to read and write. The plainsmen of Taiwan's southwest were now a literate civilization. They were joined by Chinese farmers and hunters, encouraged by the Dutch to improve the profitability of the colony. But there was friction. Chinese were taxed and natives were not. Tax disputes and the falling price of venison added to tensions, which led to Guo Huai, a sugarcane farmer, leading a rebellion of thousands of enthusiastic but poorly armed Chinese in 1652. They were crushed. Thousands of Aborigines would help the Dutch massacre the rebels and quell the uprising, killing about 10% of the Chinese population in the colony. It was clear the Aborigines owned the land, the Chinese cultivated it, and the Dutch ruled and defended this profitable colony. The Dutch-Aboriginal political arrangement seemed strong. All that changed when the Ming loyalist warlord Koxinga arrived with a battle-hardened army to oust the Dutch East India Company. During his siege of Fort Zeelandia, he promised amnesty to the natives, who mostly defected to his side, destroying churches and headhunting the Dutch amongst them. Though Aboriginal land rights were initially respected, Zheng forces did sometimes clash with natives over land later on. Koxinga won in 1662, and thousands of Fujianese soldiers dispersed to farm the land. Ming-style administration was put in place, and Confucian schools were built. It is said that native families were tax-exempt if they sent their children to these institutions. This was perhaps a policy of sanitization, but being a literate society, maybe the Sirayan could even more readily understand the advantages of being familiar with Han laws. Things would change again when the Zheng Kingdom of Dongning lost to the Qing Empire. Under the Qing, more colonizers would come, and we'd see many mixed villages now as Han men increasingly married Aboriginal women. There was a three-part understanding to land in this era. See, the lands had rightful owners. Typically, those who owned the bones of the land were Aboriginal Pingpu peoples, coastal plainsmen. The skin of the land could be leased to another party, often the Fujianese investor or local headman. They in turn rented lots out to farmers who would pay them in some percentage of the harvests. Rice, sugarcane, and other profitable crops were now being grown on Taiwan for the voracious demand on the mainland, the main driver and motive of Chinese colonization here. The southwestern plains of Taiwan were firmly in the sphere of Asian maritime trade now. It was in this era of colonization, frontier war, and the increasing Sinicization that these Sinkan manuscripts were drafted and signed. During the Qing, immigration and land grabbing intensified. Some local plainsmen, Pingputu, assimilated. Others fled to lands farther from Minnan and Hakka colonization and often adopted local cultural traits in their new homes. For example, around 1829, many Sirayan peoples migrated to today's Taidong on the other side of the mountains. Some were absolutely decimated by frontier warfare. The assimilationist policies of Japanese and Chinese Kuomintang eras further weakened the cultural continuity. That, plus centuries of close contact and blending with colonial Taiwanese Min and Hakka cultures, the experience of prejudice and sometimes perhaps some self-resentment, saw many Pingpu peoples forsake their heritage. Today, most don't speak their mother tongues, and even many elders have trouble beyond traditional songs and some common phrases and vocabulary. Many aspects of their culture remain, though, subtly, but by and large much has been lost. Yet, here's where the Sinkan manuscripts return to our story. Since the early half of the 1900s, when Murakami Naojiro published the Sinkan Manuscripts, things have changed. Siraya and other Pingpu peoples have been reclaiming their heritage. Taiwanese flatlanders are faced with the fact that most have at least some Aboriginal blood. And all of this is happening while many islanders here on Taiwan ask themselves, what does it mean to be Taiwanese? And what does that identity entail? The old translated Bibles and Sinkan manuscripts provide an opportunity at genuine language revival where many were moribund. I'm glad these bilingual contracts remain. These documents mostly come from the 1800s. This is about 150 years after the natives became literate under the Dutch. Clearly, the literary tradition was maintained, written in two different scripts, one hailing from the early days of civilization in the North China Plain, seeing thousands of years of development and use by many Chinese ethno-linguistic groups brought here by the Hakka and Minnan, and the other, an alphabet for the native language on Taiwan's southwestern plains, imported by the Dutch, derived from Latin, itself descended from Greek, and 1,000 years of derivation from Phoenician writing. Two literary traditions in the minds and brushes of Minnan and Sirayan peoples, shared space, on paper, to delineate land rights and agreements. These manuscripts are treasures to their community, an important artifact of Taiwan's history, and a reminder that our human story is not black and white. The caricatured view of the world is not only oversimplistic, it disrespects the agency and humanity of our forefathers. Colonization is often presented in a very subjective light. Backwards barbarians, noble savages, morally perfect and naturally spiritual but helpless natives. The truth is more nuanced, even if the overall trend is clear. Where there is conflict, there are winners and there are losers. That is history. While the Pingpu cultures have lost a lot, I think it is significant that here, Sinkanders and others were a literate people and allowed them to draft contracts amongst themselves and with the colonial society. I think if we are to truly respect our ancestors, we need to see them as humans with their own agency, priorities, and aspirations. I hope to honor their story by asking you, if you have a neglected mother tongue, please spend the time, learn it, and pass on the torch. Don't let this quote-unquote fire die out, because once it's gone, and not every culture has something like the Sinkan manuscripts.